You're watching Onsite COP15, a World Insight special on the ongoing UN Biodiversity Conference. Still to come, Kunming hosts the Biodiversity Conference. But outside the conference rooms, how has China been working to protect natural habitats? The Chinese president briefed the world at COP15 Leaders Summit. And there is more, a discussion I had with field experts who have been observing China's practices and approaches. Stay with us. They are the web of life we depend on. We are only part of them. Common goals need to be set. Solutions need to be carried out for the biodiversity of the earth and for you and me. I'm in China's spring city, Kunming, known for its mild weather and rich natural habitat. Bring you all the latest on COP15. Welcome back, I'm Tian Wei. This is Onsite at COP15, a World Insight special program from Kunming at the ongoing UN Biodiversity Conference. As the world hashes out biodiversity conservation goals for the next decade, China's experience and solutions in wildlife preservation have contributed to global efforts. On Tuesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping spelled out these commitments as the representative of the COP15 host country, vowing to draw up an action plan to integrate conservation with economic and social development. On the world stage, China was among the first signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and played a key part in the conclusion of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The country was also among the first to sign and ratify the Convention on Biological Diversity. While there are many more stories regarding China's wildlife conservation efforts, this year's COP15 is the chance we have at hand. On that, we gathered the voices of experts from different parts of the world, and here's their discussion. For more on China's contribution and the work done already, in Washington, D.C., Wu Changhua, China Director of the Office of Jeremy Rifkin, in Texan John Waynes, who is a professor at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology with the University of Arizona, and also in San Francisco, Peter Knights, founder and president of Wild Aid. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Mr. Knights, the reason why it is being in China has a lot to do with China as the largest developing country. But so far, how do you see China's commitment about biodiversity protections so far at this point?
Well, I think we've seen in the last few years, we've seen a major step up in the commitment of China towards biodiversity in many, many different areas, whether it's protected areas within China, whether it's international policy. I think China is really stepping up to the plate. And I think it's our great hope that Chinese leadership can bring in the United States and together move the world forward on biodiversity, because we really are in a crisis situation.
It is true. Ms. Wu.
Well, China definitely has been making tremendous efforts, in particular the last decade or so, in terms of protecting, endangered species, biodiversity, and moving more and more so actually in the last 5 years or so into something called ecological civilization and emphasizing something called ecological red lines, the boundary element there, which is looking into actually not only the science, but also reality. And in terms of regulations, policy incentives put together, and by zoning the regions, particularly on land at this moment, so far 25% of the land in China is already covered under this sort of red line ecological system framework. And if you look at the laws, regulations, they're not only protecting biodiversity, animals, species, endangered species there, but also really to build back, like in terms of planting trees and returning actually the arable land back to grasslands and even back to forests. and the awareness actually in the society about the biodiversity species probably is the highest ever.
But one of the things many of our international viewers might not be necessarily aware, that is, what exactly is the so-called the red line system in China in terms of ecological protection? Ms. Wu.
From science perspective, and we are looking into the Earth's, we call it life support system. I think the climate change, biodiversity are two among the nine. There are 9 life support systems there. So scientific research tells us we are literally crossing more than half of those 9 life support systems red line already, meaning the regenerative, the capability of the Earth to regenerate itself actually is depleted, overshot in many, many ways, so that we're literally creating deficit, right? Mm-hmm. We are over-consuming what the life or ecosystems will be able to provide to meet our needs, food, water, shelter, among others. China is in a very similar situation there as well, because China, of course, is a part of the planet systems there. So by joining the red lines at this moment is on one side reflecting the sense of urgency in terms of endangered species, land use, pollution, or among others there. By designating the red lines, literally say, okay, those are the red line areas probably will limit development in terms of land use or exploitation of resources, stuff like that, so that we'll be able to gain more time for that part of the place, the land actually, to recover, to regenerate, so that we'll be able to bring back more diversity actually back to life.
Got it. Developed economies, Professor Wings, have been doing their job, but we have very little experience about how developing countries at this point will be able to protect the biodiversity. Will China's practice be one of those that could be of inspiration or reference to the others?
Yeah, I think it's great for every country to preserve its habitats. But again, it's going to be a big problem because climate change won't respect that. It won't care. And China is one of the world's biggest polluters. And so it's actually, along with the US, of course, but it's also creating massive problems for the biodiversity of countries all around the world. So that has to be part of it also. Crucially important to preserve, habitats in China, because it is, for example, at least 10% of all plant diversity is there. And it's, almost more than half of all Chinese plant species are endemic to China. But again, the pollution being generated in China and the carbon emissions, they're affecting the whole world as well as China. So that, that has to be curtailed.
But that's very true. That's why people are looking at China and the United States, isn't it? But my question rather is, what is being done already? Not the theory of we need to do something.
No, I think the big challenge, my primary work is in those less wealthy nations. And the big challenge is not necessarily that they haven't set aside the land and the areas, it's in making the protection real. Mm-hmm. So where they really struggle is not in designating protected areas, it's in actually the enforcement mechanisms that go in to prevent the protected areas from being exploited. So I've just come back from Nigeria last week. They have 10 national parks, but most of those national parks, all the wildlife has been poached from it. And there are people coming in doing illegal logging. So there are protected areas set up in many of the developing countries, but where they need assistance and help and support is in making that protection real and effective. And that means training and support for rangers, local community projects to give other people economic alternatives. That's the real struggle in the developing world from my perspective. Not so much there's not enough protected areas, but the protected areas are not truly protected. And that's the big challenge going forward. And I hope that China and the US and other countries, more wealthy countries, can help assist those countries in the actual implementation of their protection.
Yeah, can I jump in here?
Please.
I totally echo what Peter mentioned about enforcement. I think there remains a big gap in many parts of the world, in particular in developing countries at this moment. But I do want to add a couple of other points. One is that China definitely is making its efforts, achieving progresses so far, particularly against the milestones, whatever. There are many other developing countries, actually, they are probably doing even better than China. And if you look at Colombia, if you look at forestry, reservation, if you look at the indigenous community, in North America, Latin America, among others, and even in Africa, there are many thousands of cases, best practices actually existing in terms of how to protect, the local biodiversity there. I think China also needs to learn in many ways from them. The second point I do want to add, so one, in terms of, US, China, largest economies actually joining hands, providing resources or expertise to support other developing countries there. We probably noticed actually just a couple of weeks ago at the UN, General Assembly this year, President Xi Jinping announced something called a new global development initiative. And President Biden actually has also put on the table sort of a new thinking around development, right? Global development. What does that mean? That means actually the two largest economies are committing to put more resources and efforts, including money, besides expertise, to support other developing countries. Of course, biodiversity, nature conservation would be part of it, but also climate change and other, like infrastructure and others there. So I think lots of things are happening there. So yes, on one side, the two countries could do it on their own, each doing their own stuff like that. But the more important, from resource utilization, perspective, I think it's better for the two countries at least to join together, particularly around biodiversity conservation, climate change, to really work together to in other developing countries actually to support them to advance the agenda.
Right. One of the things people notice is how this protection of biodiversity related to the climate change. On that point, earlier I talked to the executive chairman of State Grid, one of the largest companies in the world, and certainly providing most of the electricity to hundreds of millions of households in China and also to the industry. They already have very clear, Mr. Knights, step-by-step plan until 2030. So that's one of the things that maybe the world is not necessarily aware of. The other thing is China has already committed about not to build more coal power plants in other parts of the world beyond its border. It is also working on its own plan to reduce the carbon emission from coal power plants. So, Mr. Knights, how do you see these developments?
The governments and countries which move away from coal and into these new technologies, whether it's solar or wind, are going to lead the way on the next industrial revolution. So this is a very smart and intelligent move, both in terms of the environment, but also business-wise. And I think, a lot of countries, we need that kind of sweeping move, commitment away. If we're going to hit any of these targets, we need those tangible things that are going to come in there and say, this is how we're going to hit those targets. And so very, very positive. And I hope that can be reflected around the world as well. But as we mentioned earlier, it's not just about making those commitments, it's also about supporting those countries in what might be in the short term more expensive means of getting electricity, for example.
Right.
But in the long term, for the good of the humanity, for the good of the planet, we need to support those technologies and reject these old technologies which have been so damaging.
Of course, China also itself is struggling, Mr. Knights. As you may know, there are stories about electricity shortage in some parts of the country as a result of this transition, which is not easy to be done.
Transition a whole economic system away from a totally unsustainable methodology to a sustainable methodology. Nothing is easy about that. We have to realize that and recognize that. But the alternatives are worse. And that's what we've got to realize. If we continue along the path we're going and we have more and more weather disasters and collapse of biodiversity, the costs are going to be much, much higher. But no one, I think, is suggesting that this transition is going to be an easy one. And it takes real leadership and it takes real commitment. And I would commend China from that commitment on the coal fight. It needs that kind of bold statement and that move if we are going to make our lives sustainable in the future.
I don't think that the question around the connectivity between biodiversity and climate change has been addressed yet at this conversation. I think the science are telling us, and we know more than ever, the interconnectivity between biodiversity, between nature and the climate change there. And nature, land, soil, and ocean happen to absorb, about half of the global emissions from human activities there. So this is where I think, of course, on one side, we do need to reduce emissions as much as possible, as fast as possible. But on the other side, we do need to protect nature. That is why the biodiversity, COP15 becomes so significant. In that context, I do want to bring in the China issue. In terms of emission reductions, there is fascinating to see State Grid and many more companies coming on board, committing carbon neutrality with the specific timelines there. But somehow, to a large extent, I think two ways of looking at it. One is obligations. So China, I call this 10 billion tons emissions sort of a puzzle, because we count about 1/3 of global emissions today, every year. So that has become the biggest piece of the puzzle that's going to not only the country itself, but also global community to work together to address. On the other side, I think this is a pivotal moment in terms of energy transition. And China, as the second largest economy and largest emerging economy, definitely is well positioned to invest differently, invest in the future that really address both on the nature side to halt nature losses, but also address the carbon issues there. On the other side, really to transform not only its energy infrastructure, but also economy.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for joining us for this conversation. Wu Changhua, John Wins, and Peter Knight. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And with that, we're coming to the end of today's On-Site at COP15, World Insight Special Program of the UN Biodiversity Conference 2020. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my teams here in Kunming and back in Beijing, thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.